Okay, so today we're going to start with by finishing Iamblichus 211, the Mysteriis, just the chapter we were reading.
Mm-hmm.
And then I have some slides about magic and theurgy, and I'm going to give like an overview of Iamblichus's theory of sacrifice that will enter into some of the
Okay.
questions we ended with last time.
Sounds good. Yeah.
Okay, so let's start. We were in chapter 211. So this is page 115 of the book, right? And we had read all the way to the end of the main paragraph too. And so the attention of the gods is awakened by themselves, receiving from no inferior being any principle for themselves of their characteristic activity. Um, we had some questions about, oh, well, do you really need to be a philosopher for the ritual to work? Does it still work partially? We'll get into that with the slides, but I want to finish the text first. So read from I have labored.
Okay. I've labored this point at some length for this reason. That you do not believe that all authority over activity so you should not believe, right? That all authority over activity in the theurgic rites depends on us. Or suppose that their genuine performance is assured by the true condition of our act of thinking. Like that would be enough to thinking, or that they are made to be false by our deception, meaning that they're false because they have these non-Platonic words or things like that.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
Four, not even if we know the particular traits that accompany each kind, have we hit, not even if we know the particular traits that
The,
accompany each
the,
kind, have we hit upon the truth in regards to the performance of sacred rites.
right. So that's the particular traits that accompany each kind. I take it that it's the what most of this whole chapter was about, or whole book was about, which was like he describes in for each kind of divine or being or spirit what its manifestation is like. So what is the light like? How does it move and all that stuff?
Okay, so and
Okay.
it's not enough to know that.
Yeah.
Um, Effective union certainly never takes place without knowledge. But, and where goes now 16. No, that's all. I'm missing.
You don't have 117?
No, it jumps here. That's the document that you sent me.
Mhm. Yeah. Oh,
116, I
well,
have Greek, and then
oh, then let
maybe
me
it's
just
in,
share.
is it in another document that you sent me?
It should have been there. Let me just
Uh,
share it here. Okay. But okay, let me make this bigger. There.
okay, I don't know why my document doesn't have this. I could find the whole pay thing somewhere, but okay, I'll just read from
Mm.
here. Then, nevertheless, so it's we don't have it doesn't take place without knowledge. Nevertheless, it is not identical with it. Thus, divine purity does not come about through right knowledge in the way that bodily purity does through chastity, which, okay, but divine union and purification actually go beyond knowledge. I don't know what like bodily purity thing is. Like nothing then of any such qualities in us, such as are humans, contributes in any way towards the accomplishment of divine transactions.
Right. So I guess the point about bodily purity through chastity is that so chastity, so like refraining from sex you should have, right? Refraining from all sex. And that's something that we can do on our own, and that's enough to have a certain kind of bodily purity.
Hmm.
Um, but and presumably having right knowledge is also something we can do on our own. We can study and so on, debate, come to have, strong arguments about how gods should appear and so on. But that is not enough for um, divine purity. And now that it is curious here that he's running together divine purity with effective union. And right, because he was saying that, effective union um is not knowledge, and now he says divine purity does not come about through right knowledge. So why might he be doing that? He might be doing that for a couple of reasons. One reason is because he is a Platonist and he's very committed to the idea that the gods are immutable. And so they don't change or move. They're necessarily omnipresent and always acting. So when they manifest or when we are united with them, it's not them that's changed, it's us. And one way of describing that change is to say, we've become divinely pure. And so that's why he says, divine purity does not come about through right knowledge. You might not want to say this entirely because, well, as we saw, Plotinus already made an argument, and Iamblichus, as far as we know, followed him on this, that purification is not enough. Since we're not inherently good, we also need to turn towards good things. But even that's just turning towards nous. So that's just, as it were, right knowledge. So he's saying that there's this divine purity, which would be something more than that. Right? And so so that's one way of taking this idea of divine purity, that divine purity does not come about through right knowledge. Um, there was another way, but I'm blanking on it right now. But anyway, that's the contrast here. Chastity and bodily purity is something that we're supposed to obtain on our own, like knowledge, but divine purity is not like that.
Okay, so sort of it's not even enough, even this bodily purity, which might be important for, like we saw in the other text, like in order to always be thinking, you can't be busy with the bodily stuff, but that's something you can do, but divine unification is not something you can do. Um, Allow me to contribute this as an afterthought, but one that will refute sufficiently your entire conception of the theurgic technique. What you are asserting here has the same force as that in which you declare that scientific understanding about the gods is a holy and useful thing, and you called ignorance of things honorable and lovely darkness, but the knowledge of them light. You consider the one to have filled human beings with all ills because of your ignorance and audacity, but the other, meaning the theurgic things, but the other, the like a scientific understanding, to be the cause of all goods. All these statements tend in the same direction as those mentioned previously, and together with them they have received proper consideration. We may therefore leave these topics and pass on to questions concerning divination and resolve them concisely.
Right. So the general view that he's opposing here is that that the all you need to do is acquire knowledge and live according to your knowledge. That's the cause of all goods, right? Of knowing the truth about the gods. The cause of all evils is ignorance about the gods. He's saying this is not the case. You need something more than just knowledge. You need also these rites and rituals, right? So now we're gonna turn. So in this text, it seemed like it had this view of the theurgy of the perfect, where you need to have knowledge is a prerequisite for effective union. It's a prerequisite for effective rituals, and there was a question. Well, there's also a question about like still like why are rituals necessary? I brought in the Phaedrus and also the Republic as some Platonic background, but there's a question still about like the exercise that Plotinus does, for instance, of like imagine the world and take away its shape and take away its mass, and then the God will come to you. Isn't that enough for isn't that like a mental kind of theurgy? Why can't we just have this kind of immaterial theurgy? And then the difference between the like Porphyry Plotinus side and the Iamblichus side is not so clear. And also, there's the question of, well, aren't there also like priests and other ritual experts who do rituals, but they're not experts in philosophy and their things work? And if you need to be a philosopher for rights to work, don't we? Um, does that mean that only philosophers have to do them?
Give me 1 second. Yeah, this could you call mommy and tell her to call you a taxi? Bye.
Okay.
That's done.
And so we have all these questions. So we have to look at a bit about about the distinction between theurgy and magic, and also Iamblichus's arguments about like who has to do theurgy and why you have to do specifically material theurgy. Um, so I have some slides about that.
Can I like ask one thing? Like, is there a thought that I mean, we have this thought that things that go beyond intellect also go below it, like the one and the God, things like that. So then it seems like if the point of these theurgy is not uh, like to gain the formal understanding, the intellectual understanding, it's beyond that. So it should also go below that, which means you don't really need the understanding. Like then we lose this like prerequisite.
Yeah. So that uh, we we'll see that he does have some ideas like that.
Mm,
And
I can't.
um,
Oh, yes, I'm in my class. I can't talk now. Please talk to mommy. Thank you. Uh,
so uh,
I'm sorry. I'm literally in the thing. Yeah.
yeah, so we'll see something like that. I mean, there will be this idea that the higher causes act to lower things. And so, in some sense, you can also do rituals without being a philosopher, but then also, you won't obtain all the benefits of of that ritual. You'll only get, like if you're only doing it on a material level, it'll only benefit you on a material level, things like
Hmm.
that. Um,
And can we do the same kind of argument for purification? Like something like purification is only to identify you with their soul, but if the activity of the gods go beyond the soul to the body, then you don't even need to be pure. You can just do magic. You can
well,
be a bad person, basically.
you can be a bad person, basically. That's I mean, yeah, I mean, not in a, I mean, of course you can always be a bad person. And bad people are also subject to the omnipotence of the gods, and there are, everything also happens according to the God's will. But it's not the kind of union with the gods that's going to be good for you. Um, but I mean these are good questions, but let's go to the texts.
Okay, I'm just throwing out ideas.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Because I know some like medieval Jewish sort of half magical, half theurgic texts say things like these names work even if you're not pure, and they like have differences. Like some you need purification, and some don't because they're higher, so they don't care about if you're pure.
Yeah, we'll see that there are that Iamblichus also talks about that about something
Mm.
stuff. Yeah. So, but let's take a step back and let's look
Okay,
at Plotinus. So first, Plotinus discusses magic and questions on the soul. And so he has an explanation on magic that's entirely due to sympathy, right? So he the he's asking like how do the magical operations work, and he says in fact they are due to the operation of sympathy, and because there is by nature concord of things that are the same and opposition of things that are not the same, and by the variegation of the many powers that contribute to the one living being. The one living being is the world. Indeed, many things are attracted and bewitched without any other person contriving it. And in fact, the real magic is the love in the universe and the strife that accompanies it. And this is the primary magician and spellbinder. When people have come to have a good understanding of him, they use his spells and sorceries against each other. And because men naturally love and the things that make them love attract each other, the strength of a lovecraft by means of magic has arisen, with the practitioners applying by their contacts different kinds of devices to different people, which draw them and have the power of love inherent in them. And they bring one soul into contact with another, as if they were drawing plants which are separate into contact with each other. So, I mean, he has in mind specifically love magic here, right? But in general, he has this account of magic as a technique that makes use of the hidden properties or what would later be called occult properties of things. Um, so, what are these occult properties? Well, there are similarities or differences between things, but there are similarities and differences that aren't accounted by their material makeup, right? So it's things like why do you say that the rooster is solar or has an affinity with the sun is supposed to be an occult property of it? Why? Well, because there's nothing in what the rooster is made out of that makes it sun-like, right? It's not made out of light or something. However, it is a property of its structure, of its form, that that it crows in the morning, right? And because it's not based in its matter, it's later called an occult property, right? So that's it's by playing with these kinds of or manipulating these kinds of similarities or differences between things, and that you can then have effects on things that aren't through one body acting on another as a body, right? And that's magic. But you're still playing, or this is still, as it were, a technique that is just as it were, it knows how to manipulate these similarities or differences between things. Right? So that's what magic is. And the thing is that Plotinus, he has the same account of prayer. So when he's talking about prayer to the planets, right? Because he's talking about his interest here is actually in like, do the celestial souls have to have memory in order to hear our prayers, right? Because you're praying to the sun or something. And then he says no, precisely because they need because it's all through sympathy. But there is no question of the sun or another heavenly body hearkening to a prayer. What happens in accordance with the prayer does so because one part has come to be in sympathy with another, as in the case of a single string that is tensed. For when it has touched at the lower, for when it has been touched at the lower end, it vibrates at the upper end too. And often, when one string is touched, another experiences a sort of sense perception of that due to their being in concord and being tuned to a single scale. But if in one lyre vibration can be transmitted from another, and to the extent that they're in sympathy too, in the universe there is a single harmony, even if it is composed of opposites. It is composed of things that are all the same in the kin, even when they are opposites. So here he uses this metaphor of resonance, right? So the idea is that if you strike a lyre, if you strike a chord, then another chord in the vicinity, even if it's not touching, will also vibrate at the same frequency. And the or also you also clear if it's one single string that's tensed. So if you pluck at the bottom, the top will also vibrate. And he says that so And this is something automatic just by the relationship of being connected by the same form. And so he's saying that something happens similarly with when you're praying to, say, the sun or the moon, you are, as it were, striking the lunar cord down here. That's going to produce some kind of effect up there, and then also down here and somewhere else, right? That you want to influence. Or in another way, you can be, as it were, um, by acting in a lunar fashion, you become more susceptible to what the moon is always doing, and therefore receive its beneficial influences. Since it's a celestial body, so it's divine, so it's good, and you want to be open to its influences. Um, right. So the Plotinus seems to have the same view of how prayer works and how magic works. None of them involve anything to do with the will of the gods. It's all about how the universe is harmoniously organized, and there are these relations of similarity and difference between things, of love and strife. And this is a technique that you exploit for certain ends, right? It's like cosmic medicine, right? And Iamblichus thinks the same thing about magic. Okay, so Iamblichus, when he discusses magic, and so he discusses in a few places. This is a place where he's more specifically also again discussing love potions, but it's the same account, right? So we must bear in mind that the universe is a single living being. The parts within it are spatially distinct, but strive towards each other by virtue of their single nature. The force of cohesion in the universe and the cause of their blending draws the parts naturally towards mingling with one another. This force, however, can be artificially aroused and intensified more than is proper. In and of itself, this force and that tension extending throughout the cosmos which derives from it is good and a cause of fulfillment, coordinates community and union and symmetry, and by its unity introduces an indissoluble principle of love, dominating all things both that exist eternally and that have come into being. At the level of the individual parts, however, by reason of their distinction from each other and the whole, and because according to their proper nature they are incomplete, non-self-sufficient, and weak, their mutual contact is brought about with the accompaniment of passion, for which reason it comes about that desire and innate mutual attraction are present in the great majority of them. So in the cosmos, there is this activity of unity, of love, right? This is so at the level of the wholes, this is something the cosmos does, right? It's not something that it suffers. But since we're just parts of the cosmos, we suffer this, right? We have these emotions that bind us to each other. And then he says, seeing then this force that's implanted in nature and distributed throughout it, art, craft, right, the craft of magic, which is itself divided in many forms throughout nature, draws it in various ways and channels it. It brings to disorder that which was ordered of itself, fills the beauty and the symmetry of the forms with the asymmetry and ugliness, and transfers the noble end associated with unity to another unseemly sort of fulfillment of vulgar one, a union of disparate elements brought together somehow under the guise of passion. Right. So here, of course, he's not attacking all art, but he's saying, yeah, he has the context that Porphyry is asking him, why can, uh, how can the gods both demand like sexual propriety, and at the same time there are these love potions, love spells that accordingly also act through the gods and cause people to engage in adultery and other illicit sexual relations. And so he has these in mind. That's why he's saying that art here, can manipulate these things and produce ugliness and disorder. But anyway, the point here is that magic also works through sympathy. Um, that I ran into sympathy without, giving a short recap, just for a short recap. So it's an idea that you find in medical texts of the time, was very important to the Stoics, that if you have organic unity of something, you don't need to act in always through contiguity, but rather when you're dealing with a living being, sometimes you'll apply a medicine on one part of the body to heal a different part. The example that they like to give is that you can say you can put an ointment on the horns of an ox to cure something about its hooves, or also you can explain this through um, like the disease. So you can have a headache because something is wrong with your stomach without like something being wrong in your chest. Um, Plotinus used this also to explain things to do with perception and also like the presence of the soul in the body. So, for instance, you can so he thought that, for instance, what explains perception is that there's in some sense some sympathy between the power of sight, let's say, looking at things, and the color of the seen object, without there needing to be anything in between that has that same color. So Plotinus likes to use the example of it's at night, everything's pitch black, but you see a fire all the way in the distance. And in his theory, you don't need, as it were, some kind of a visual ray coming from the fire hitting you and making everything in between luminous. No, rather you can see it's rather because you have something that is like light in your power of sight, and that is luminous, and then it's this sympathy that is sufficient for vision. Um, and the right, and there's also something like a different way in which this is actually tied to the presence of the soul as a whole in the whole body. But like Plotinus also argues, for instance, that the soul as a whole has to be in your feet, and also in your brain, and also and in every part of your body. Part of the argument here is that when your feet, for instance, feel something, they feel cold or they feel the ground beneath their feet, this perception of cold or the ground, needs to be, in order to be perceived as such, it needs to be distinguished from other perceptions, say of color. And in order to do that, you need reason. And reason is actually required for every part of the soul to function properly. And so the whole soul is wherever reason is. So reason is there as well. And you can think of that also as it were, as a sympathetic relationship between the foot and where reason primarily is, which would be the nervous system, like the brain and the nervous system. According to Plotinus, because he's a Platonist, he's following the Timaeus, and against Aristotle, who thought that reason is enough. So um, and so there's again a direct contact that doesn't go through any kind of bodily contact or continuity. So it's
Mhm.
manipulating these, as it were, biological relations of the universe, right? So the Stoics argue that the has this kind of sympathy as well because of phenomena like uh, astrological phenomena, but also things like seasons and the tides that show that there's a connection between the moon and the sea. Um, that magic works, and so Plotinus thought that magic and prayer worked that way, but Iamblichus, it's just magic. Um, he makes clear point that sacrifice doesn't work this way. But let me pause here to see if you have questions about the whole sympathy and magic.
Yeah, so the questions. I mean, one question would at least be that probably nowadays we would say no, at least for biological things, we would say no, everything works through a kind of touch. Like if I feel something in my foot, it's because the nerves have some pathway, or if I take a medicine. But like it could seem weird if I eat something and then my brain feels different or something, but there's at least we have these theories of uh, all kind of physical pathways and ways in which you can put a medicine in your ear and then it heals your foot or something. Um,
Right. So of course we nowadays we don't employ sympathy in our medical theories. But the yeah, I mean the Plotinus's um argument that sympathy is needed for perception is one thing to make this maybe a bit more plausible. Also, um what was I going to say? Also, Proclus, he has an argument in when he discusses time that sympathy is required for there being a now. Um, and the basic idea is, well, how can there be, as it were, a single time in the whole universe, right? He takes it as like part of our perception of time that there's, as it were, a now, a single now. There's an so he takes that as a given. And however, everything in the universe has its own, as it were, is going through its own processes. And why should there be, as it were, a common measure for all the different processes? And um, Proclus, so that you could say, that there's a now, right? Like, so, I don't know, like, now is the n trillionth second of the universe since the beginning of this cosmic cycle. Um, and so Aristotle says, oh, it's not a problem. It's like saying that, use the number 10 to count 10 horses and 10 dogs. But Proclus will say, no, there's a problem here because, 10 horses, well, 10 horses and 10 dogs is bad. Or rather, my intuitions aren't so good about this. But for instance, there are 10 ants and 10 dogs. So 10 ants isn't really a lot of ants because usually you see ants in far greater quantities together. But 10 dogs is already a good number of dogs, right? So the meaning of 10 in these two cases is distinct because of what they are. And similarly, the being the n trillion second is going to mean different things for different things in the universe. And so you don't really have a single process, a single time happening in the universe. And then he says, so in order for there to be a single time in the universe and there to be, real simultaneity, you need for there to be a single life, right? And so there needs to be this single living being that has this single process, the life of this living being being processed in everything else, and all the different uh, processes in the world are, as it were, synchronized by this single life. So even though it's this day is means one thing for the race of dogs and for each individual dog, and something very different for human beings, these we can still say that they're part of the same time. There's one single time measuring all of them because they're just, as it were, um, all contributing to the life of the single organism. The same way that you can tell a person's age, even though their body has a bunch of different processes going on. Their liver is doing one thing, their heart is doing another, and so on. And and so there's and so that's like a different argument for the world being a single living being that doesn't involve, as it were, any specific chemical or chemical claims or empirical claims. It makes it more transcendental. The like the way One way of understanding this is of understanding these relations more, even if we don't use these. Uh, I don't know. We so that we have different medical theories is to go back to what I mentioned about like the narrative view of the world last time. So I talked about like someone who goes to be purified because they think that someone threw the evil eye on them. And so they only notice that because they've had bad luck. And if you're just looking at mechanical causes, you'll never notice bad luck. It doesn't exist from your point of view. Um, and simply, there's something like, I don't know, the fact that so you can think of like the occult properties of things and how they're used in magic as having to do with their narrative properties. So it's the claim is that there is narrative coherence to the world. This also goes back to the idea that, to Crofts' argument about that there has to be a single time in the world. So there's like some kind of narrative coherence. It's not just one random thing after another, but this narrative coherence. And so if you're thinking about narrative coherence, then for instance, it it's like you have to think about like what would be significant if you were reading a novel. And like it would certainly be significant if you're reading a novel if it's a day where someone has many like a new path was open to them at their job and they opened a door opened a lock that they had redone for the first time at home. So it's this kind of narrative sympathy, to use the word, that's you know being invoked here.
Hmm.
Um, I think um, that's so. Um, that's the point of view that one can take if you want to try to make these things a bit more plausible.
Right. So, uh, what I was thinking, something like, so one point would be like, I guess the question is what science or what like beginning point we take as the sort of measure of intelligibility. Like, because I was reading the chapter 72 in the guide, it talks about this. It's all about this the world as one living being. And that's why I asked you the questions about the spheres. And it seems like at least the modern readers that I was reading were reading it backwards, I think, because for Plato and Aristotle, the like ideal, the like most understandable thing is biological, or is like one human or one animal even. There's a question if it's a human or an animal, but okay. And then they interpret the cosmos as at least analogous to like one animal, or it's the kind of oneness that an animal has. It has things like that. Um, the modern paradigm of science at least claims to take physics as the most basic way of understanding, like mechanical movement, mechanical change. And of course, there's a weird thing because our medical theories, uh, like we said, are at least pretend we don't really have a explanation for why every medicine works, right? It's somewhat a conjecture, but at least we try to explain everything by like direct interactions. But it's not clear if our physical theories actually do that. Like people famously said that Newton doesn't make sense because he has action at a distance. And then maybe modern theories of gravity claims that there is some touch. I don't know how. I guess it becomes a philosophical question at some point. Um, but I think because of that, it becomes harder to read all these ancient texts because we at least are told that it's physics that is the most basic thing. It's not only the most basic thing, it's the most basic kind of explanation, like things pushing each other. And then we pretend that biology should fit into it, although we don't actually have a biological theory that fits into that. Like biology is still a lot more Aristotelian than physics, maybe just because biology is not very well developed still. We don't really understand living things as well as we do so-called dead things. Um, like doctors are still playing in the dark in a lot of ways. Um,
Right.
so what I was thinking is something like so like that's why. So we tend to take whatever is clearer to us and say like we understand mechanical motion, and then like we're assuming that everything else that's the thing that makes the most sense, and then we're assuming that everything else works like that, and then we say, okay, but is there a mechanical motion in the stars that apply to us? And then we say, well, in some sense, the answer is for sure yes, like the Carl Sagan kind of thing, we're all pieces of stars or something like that. Um, but that doesn't like have any meaning, right? But mechanical motion, by the way we understand it, doesn't have any meaning. Um, versus biology, which has a kind of meaning, which is just a word for a kind of direction, right? A kind of telos. We living things seem to at least be trying to do something, and
Yeah,
mechanical things, in the way we understand it, aren't trying to do anything.
yeah,
So I guess I don't know. Maybe I'm confusing things, but I
r-
guess the question would be the real question for like sympathy is one little thing, but the real question would be: is there a kind of direction in the whole universe, like in, or at least, I don't know, take the whole solar system for a little start, right?
right.
Is there a story? Is it even correct? Like we have these, we live in these kind of stories. Like we say, it's a month, it's a year. The moon has done one revolution, so on. The sun, or we've done a revolution around the sun. We call that a year, but that doesn't really mean anything according to modern astronomy. And
Yeah.
while it does,
So,
when we say a living thing has had its cycle, right? It's lived and it
mm,
died. That is still a story that makes sense to us. At least we can say, well, we don't believe in teleology, so it doesn't really mean anything, but it still seems to mean something. Um, I guess that's where the problem starts. Does it make any sense? What I'm And
it
then we have
does.
all
It
these like
does.
modern, like Michael, like all the modern like biology who try to claim that biology does have actual direction. Maybe it's even like electrical signals or whatever. All these emergence and things, and who are doing a kind of a formal Aristotelian end explanation of biology, and then it might be possible to expand that to bigger levels, although it's probably much harder and definitely hard to connect these things, right? Like how
Right. The So there's lots to be said here. As you mentioned, uh, there are entire questions about whether physics is mechanical at all. And of course, like um, you know, our atoms are not Lucretian atoms. They are these very weird things. And there seems to be some kind of action at a distance there. And you know, gravity originally, what there was suspicious um, that there was it was suspicious because there was action at a distance. Um, but gravity is a good thing because it's a trope in modern authors that want to be poetic, to talk about gravity as the love of the universe, as the mutual power of attraction. And you see this in romantic comedies, even things like that. And
like
but
that's just what
and
empirically is called love.
yeah, which is what emphatically is called love. And Giordano Bruno, he explains he explains gravitational phenomena through sympathy. He says, right, because he can't use he has first well, like one of the first people to have this infinite world with an infinite amount of solar systems and so on. And so he can't have everything falling because it goes to the center. No, he says, why do things fall down? Because they're actually parts of the planets. They're organic parts of the planets, and they want to return to their planets, to return to the living being. And so he explains that, and he explains that planets orbit around stars because they're actually animals that feed off of the light and the emanations from the stars. And um, so he uses sympathy in order to, and in a very Neoplatonic way, to explain the gravitational phenomena and to account for this infinite universe that would in principle be totally Platonic. Now, the question about, um, well, of course, the question is like, what is the basic unit of intelligibility? And there is this idea that one thing pushing another is the most easiest thing to understand. Um, but uh, one can raise questions about that, of course. And um, one can raise questions, for instance, about how can we understand, like, so why does everything have to have, say, a final cause for Proclus? Um, it has to do with the fact, so efficient causes tell us why a change begins or why something changes, right? Final causes are supposed to tell us why something ends, why a change ends, right? So something has a tendency to achieve, as it were, stability in a certain state, right? So either it stops changing or it enters into a cycle that just keeps repeating, right? And that's what the final clause explains. It explains, oh, what does it mean to say that this is goal directed? Well, it means that it ends. And there is a question here about so how to individuate changes. Right. Gilbert and Sullivan and I think it was the Mikado. Um, I forget. In one of his operettas, he has a nobleman boast about how he can trace back his ancestry all the way back to the unicellular organisms. And a joke so about, of course, evolution, big new thing at the time, but it also raised the question about like where does the story of this unicellular organism end? How do we pick it out? Right? We also have this question in like history. When does the 19th century really end? Right? Long 19th century, where does it actually stop? And things like that. And it seems like if you don't have final causes, there's no answer to this, right? And there's because then things don't intrinsically have stopping points. Processes don't end. It's just one thing after another. So why do you cut, as it were, the whole changing universe? Why do you cut it here? So these final causes, they have a purpose of, as it were, chopping up the world so that you have discrete processes that end. The same way that efficient causes tell you when things begin, right? And formal causes, which would be, as it were, just the structure of changes, saying that this kind of thing, it starts off as an embryo, then it's a fetus, then it grows, and then it dies, or this comet, if it goes around in this way, um, those tell us why things are connected, and so they're present. So and these things seem to be, and being able to point to something and separate it out from other things seems to be basic to intelligibility, right? um, and say, oh, I understand this. So you have picked this out, right? And so if it's a change, you're going to have to separate it from changes before and after, besides changes around it. And so there's a reason to think that having goal directedness is part of what makes changes intelligible. Um, so that's yeah. And of course, sympathy is just one little bit of this teleological world.
Right. So, like another way of saying, I mean, another way of talking about it would be like if the world runs on poetry or on math, like
Right.
or if math is just a form of poetry. Meaning,
Or
like
well,
we
yeah.
have this, okay, so I'll give you a problem for this. Like something like a very basic Aristotelian thing to do is to say we use the same word for both of these things, but they're really different words. We're just language is poor. These are
Mhm.
equivocal terms. And a sort of very basic poetic thing to do, or maybe Platonic somewhat times thing to do, is to say no. Like basically, Plato has a different solution to that kind of problem. He usually says no. There's like an ideal form of. There's a reason why all these words have the same text, And it's because they're really like instantiations of the same form, and they really do have something to do with each other, right? Like Aristotle's big example in the beginning of like the word is animal or something, meaning a picture of an animal and an animal. And there's like, well, obviously these things do have some connection, although like for you they're different substances, but maybe and like according to this Aristotelian thought, then like making pictures of things for or symbols of things can't do anything to the things because although we call them by the same name and we even like maybe recall one by the other or something, uh, there's no real connection between these two things. And then like the poetic way would any poet would tell you, well, no, that's crazy. My whole job is finding words that are the same for different things and somehow connecting them, right? Uh, and then what we tend to think is like, okay, but poetry doesn't have anything to do with reality. So why is there such a like? Why do people like it? I don't know for some weird reason. It's just what does it even mean to say that? Well, yeah, it's poetic to say that gravity is love, but those are obviously not things that have nothing to do with each other, right? Like me loving someone is not like a kind of gravity. It's not like I'm falling onto them or like two bodies. Like yeah, it's two bodies attracting each other, but very in a very different meaning. And like maybe you're using it just to like intensify your feeling of love. Okay, my body is to you like the body, like maybe I'm just orbiting around you, or maybe I'm actually touching, or whatever. And like someone might claim something like there's something weird about poetry having no reality behind it, or I don't know if that's a proof or anything, but something like maybe or we go back to like question of basic intelligibility. Maybe we shouldn't try to understand things by cutting them up into different substances so much, and maybe the poetry of the two bodies attract. Maybe it is actually the sun and the moon that causes people to love, or that. I mean, I think that the real question would be something, even like some very like science trademark person would say something like, it might be true that the stars, or who knows, there's like bacteria in your gut who gets influenced by the phases of the moon. Who nobody knows if these things are not even literally true. It's just that we don't really know enough detail of how it works for him to make for your potion to work. And your potion maybe your poetry just isn't precise enough, something like that.
Mm.
Uh,
Yeah, and well, that's right. You can put it that way. I don't know if mathematics would be the contrast here, because, you know, already in the ancients, mathematics could describe the motions of the heavens. And actually, describing things mathematically shows that they have a certain form, a certain structure. Um, and it's so I
right.
don't know.
Maybe that's just like a contradiction in the matter and like what you get taught in school, where you get taught like on the one hand that everything is mechanics, and on the other hand that everything is math, and those thoughts don't really work together.
Right. Yeah. The um yeah, so like the I don't know, we have ideas about so like I don't know, saturation. So like there's only so much sugar that you can mix into a cup of water. And so there's a certain proportion there of like sugar to water that you can achieve. And so there's, saying that, there's a certain relationship between sugar and water, that's entirely, as it were, on the level of form. And then it's like only later that people developed as it were, chemical explanation about molecules forming bonds and things like that. That explains why you can only, connect so many sugar molecules to so many um, uh, water molecules and things like that. Um, and but so there's like, yeah, that's just to underline the point. Yeah, and you can argue, and I mean, just to make clear, like Plato, of course, also does occasionally say, no, these are two words that this is one word used in two different ways. It's not every kind of equivocation that he's going to try to say. Like I don't know, riverbank and Bank of America. But the and like part of the thing about poetry and also like the ancient world is like so like the arguments I brought, it's about, oh, we perceive that all that processes are distinct and that they start and stop, they have a beginning and an end, or also that we perceive that there is a single now. And so in general, the point is like this way of thinking goes back to our some kind of natural way of perceiving things, right? And so like our concrete experience and whatever and like the basic argument then is like this, he describes like a poetic way of seeing the world, or this ancient way. It's how we experience the world and how it's given to us, always. Like even if you look at your instruments in the lab, you are you're going to be seeing them, uh, presupposing that there's a now and that things start and stop and things like that. So that's like part of the basic, apologia of ancient thought and poetic ways of seeing is like, well, you when you do the science and science trademark and you are actually just abstracting from a bunch of things, and that lets you control the phenomena and predict them better. And so you're focusing in on just a little small part of existence, the things that we can control and repeat. But this other way of thinking has to do with, how the world actually appears to us. And that's what we, and that's something real, like it's something real, for instance, in the sense that you can't shake it away, right? And it's how how the abstracted world comes through us. So if this experience isn't real, then the abstracted world is also in question, and therefore it should be taken seriously as well. Um, but
Right.
I think like this
I
is
guess
getting us to,
we're
right,
getting us too much.
yeah, but no, we can finish. Like just to remind ourselves, like why is it important to think about this when we're trying to understand the development of Neoplatonic virtue theory?
Mm-hmm.
Well, one of the weird things about the later virtue theory is that it requires the use of ritual, or thinks that usually use of ritual is really important. And so it's important to get ourselves into a mindset where we can understand why this kind of, why magic works or why ritual works. And so we have to like see this kind of
Mm-hmm.
the plausibility of this to then understand um, the the ritual theory and the later virtue theory. Right.
Right. I guess if we were to add this, we would add like a new kind of virtue, could like narrative or poetic virtue, which is required to be a full human being in order to.
Right. And you'll think like that narrative is actually something big in contemporary ethics, right? Following Alasdair MacIntyre, right? So
Right.
I mean, him and like Paul McClure and other people really talk. No, look, like human life has this narrative structure, and virtue involves having like a successful narrative structure or something like that, and
Mm-hmm.
fulfilling your quests and things.
I mean,
And yeah,
yeah, one other thing I would think about that, just because it's important, is that the mechanical kind of points of view, it's not like I guess this maybe this is really something going on sometimes. Like it's not really correct that some like the way sometimes people apologize is something like uh your science, like modern science, can tell you how to control things and predict things, but we don't actually think that way in the narrative sense. And then like you say, religion or whatever is is for that. But I think that the problem is with that is that science also has a narrative, and like Plato would be very happy with saying like, if you think that the whole world is just things pushing and pulling, you probably will live your life that way also. So it's actually true that the modern people are also influenced by the stars, or at least by their views of the stars. just that they're going around pushing and pulling. And Plato wants to tell you, no, it's like the noose convincing the stars to be that way, or they want to be that way. Like there's a lot less coercion in the in some sense, there's a lot less coercion in the a lot less force, at least in the way it's described. Um, or I mean, the big example of this is Darwinianism, which where there's very explicitly a Darwinian social program or ethical program or anti-ethical program, and then like since the Holocaust, people just let's just not talk about it, but it's still the way we actually think. Um, and then it
Um,
becomes a problem. Like, how do you could you even justify a view of ethics which is not Darwinian? Like, how why would there be such a thing, or is it just us lying to ourselves or something?
right, exactly. And then there are all these modern questions about, well, what is the ground of ethics? It seems like it's, the world doesn't have ends in them. It doesn't work this narrative way, but for us to act ethically, it's part of what it involves this view and talk about ends and so on. And then it seems to be something free floating, and people get, life doesn't mean anything, and so on. And there's this classical move of saying, yes, modern people are individualist and materialist because they have this worldview that everything is individual and wholes don't exist. And so, totalities don't exist. It's actually just all these individual bits of matter interacting. But you have like, yeah, and then you have like New Age people saying, no, look, we've learned that, it's not just individual bits of matter interacting. There are these like weird quantum phenomena, and so we should love each other and things like that. So, I mean, yeah, there's all that. I think like the interest in the ancient stuff in ancient natural philosophy, right? So talking about how they talked about medicine and the stars and all that is that it's in here there are false empirical claims, there are some true empirical claims that they drew different conclusions from, but there's also amongst that there's an account of there are some arguments for that the world is, as it were, has this narrative frame, and they're not they don't have as their premises anything to do with about ethics. They have their premises things to do with like talk about Plotinus argues for sympathy on the basis of perception, or Proclus argues for final causes on the basis of the fact that there's a future, and things like that.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and there's a possibility here of giving a true a better ground to ethics by going
I
back
mean, you
not
would
only
say,
to the ethical theories but also to the natural philosophy.
hmm. So if we come back to ritual, we can say something like, because like the problem with ritual, I guess, is that it only gets called ritual when it stops working. Okay. No, I mean to say, like, preparing your weapons for a battle isn't a ritual. That's just preparation for whatever you have to do. The ritual is like when you paint three arrows in a certain shape and you burn it on an altar or whatever, and that's supposed to be the symbol of the war. And then we have this question like, uh, isn't the thing itself a symbol good enough? Like, okay, I polished my gun, whatever, I don't know, whatever you do before to prepare for the thing. Why would I also go to the priest who's gonna burn the image of a gun on his thing and like and especially even in a Platonic register, right? You say like the world, the way it is an image of the world of forms or the gods and things like that. Well, why would I do things less than whatever a scientist tells you to do, or whatever a military strategist, if you're talking about the war, for example? Isn't that itself the theurgy? Like, why would we have to do other things? Which, and the answer usually becomes tradition. Like, well, and then the like materialist explanation for rituals is something is, and this is an ancient text also, right? Like, we have like explanations that say this, like, well, once upon a time, in order to polish your arrows, you had to get the skin of some animal, and that was because they didn't invent oil then or whatever. And now, even though we have better oil, the ritual people are still using the old ways of preparing your weapons, and they claim that it has some. That's like an explanation that you get for rituals being as the kind of leftover effective thing. Um, and then I guess we would someone would say, well, yes, and that the story is correct. So like it's correct that the best symbol is the thing itself. Obviously, that's the best symbol because that's nature uh, expanding
Mhm.
itself in the way that it actually works. But we don't want to stop doing the like ancient rituals because they are the ones that people would say it like this, like that's the why, right? Those are the ones that help us give a story. So if we want to fight a battle, we don't want to just fight a battle in the sense of I have this weapon that can push you and so on. I want to be like I'm this ancient people who have a reason going back 10,000 years or who knows what for this war, and and if we wouldn't do the ritual, then the story wouldn't make sense. And probably it wouldn't be effective either in some sense because at the end of the day, we're at least humans are affected by stories, but maybe also reality in some sense. Is that
Well, I mean, yeah, and we're getting close to like understanding also like what is the interest in seeing because I presented like Plotinus's view that magic and prayer both work through sympathy, and now we've got this narrative account of sympathy, and so it's like okay, magic and prayer about stories. And so this is preparing us to see the interest also in Iamblichus's account, where we saw he says, yeah, magic that works with sympathy, but then sacrifice and theurgy and prayer more generally that they don't work through
mm,
sympathy, right? So
okay?
there's going to be something besides stories here. Um, but now the to go back to like the question, like it's not just like the case of preparing your weapon. It's also not like you mentioned like oh connecting yourself to your past and to your tradition, but it's also like just thinking about battle, right? So this is something that people are uh that people forget nowadays. So people nowadays think that violence is just violence. And like you shot someone, you made this piece of metal go out from your gun and it entered the other person. But the typically when we fight with someone, we want something more than just to harm them or to be harmed. We want to beat them. We want to defeat them. And that is entirely about like narrative structure and about like what is the end of our activities, where is this going, right? And the other person has to accept defeat, and you have to like to be proclaimed victor, right? And this has to be recognized, and these are things that weapons on their own can't do, right? Just pushing things can't do, and so also there's the ritual aspects of violence are are used in parts to, as it were, make them more than just you know brute mechanical pain, so that it actually can do this function that we do to actually give victory and defeat, right? Um, that's part of the thing. And then, of course, in order for you, like victory and defeat to be intelligible, you need to know like who is fighting, and so it's important also that it connects you with your people or whatever. And um, like so, we're less concerned about this basically because we have like I mean for many reasons, but one of them is that there are these nation states which are like incredibly powerful and that they have these police that keep violence from getting out of hand, right? And so you don't like if you don't have like this police that will make sure that people don't start killing each other and getting revenge, then it's really important for you to have like a clear victor and a clear defeat, right? Otherwise the violence can get totally out of hand.
Mm,
Um, so Because we see what happens when people like refuse to accept that they've defeated, and then like the war never ends. Things like that.
Right.
But so that's one part. But like it is true. So the thing about um, is it called ritual only when it doesn't work? Well, again, when it has because I guess the narrative account lets us say, no, you can still say, oh, it has a function with regard to obtaining the desired narrative outcomes, what you want the thing to be, right? Um, like you don't want to just cause harm, or like you also want to win, right? And of course, you can say, well, this is all dependent on us and our conventions and so on. But it's hard to see the purchase of that objection here when we're talking about relations between human beings. It would be, we can think about, so like also when you want to, if you're thinking about medicine, right, you don't want to just be, stop feeling bad. You want to be recovered, right? And you want to somehow feel that that evil thing is in the past and you're a new person now and things like that. Just taking a pill, just popping a pill won't do that. And um there's um so there so there are these narrative requirements. I guess the question about like yeah, I mean, even if we're talking about rituals for good crops and so on, there you're still going to want, you know, of course, you want the good crops, so you want to use good agricultural techniques and good agricultural products. But you also want prosperity. You don't want just this and that. Um, and again, if things like prosperity and winning and being truly recovered and feeling healthy, if you think they don't exist, well, then we have basic problems about, if you go back to the natural philosophy arguments about perception, individuating things and so on.
Hmm.
Um,
I
yeah,
yeah, that's
but
I guess the yeah. The nation states we mentioned are also very good at controlling narrative. Maybe they're even better at that than they are at controlling violence, and that's why people don't like. We do have it's kind of boring rituals, but just because they work so well.
in part, but I think,
1 second, I'm closing the door. I mean, that's the kind of argument where you say, well, everyone, you also have this, just a bad one. Like, you're also doing magic because we have these like things where you put a piece of paper in a box and we pretend that that makes the king or something. Doesn't make
right,
any sense.
yeah,
Doesn't really work like that. Like, maybe, please.
yeah. So let me just wrap up
Okay.
by presenting one last slide, which is about precisely um, about how Iamblichus thinks that this is not enough to explain
Hmm.
sacrifice.
Okay.
So he writes, this is already book five of De Mysteriis, is the one it's all about sacrifice, and we'll be reading many passages from that. So he says, if we say that in the universe, being as it is, one living being, possessing a common life in all parts of itself, the communion of like powers, or the conflict of contrary ones, a certain affinity of the active for the passive principle, propels together like and suitable elements, pervading in virtue of a single sympathy, even the most distant things as if they were most contiguous, there is stated in this way something of the truth and of the necessary consequences of sacrifice, but there is still not demonstrated the true mode in which sacrifices operate. For it is not in nature nor in physical necessity that the essence of the gods resides, so as to be roused up by natural influences or by powers which extend throughout the whole universe, but is defined in its own terms, external to these influences, having nothing in common with them, either in essence or in potency or in any other respect. So the point is, okay, we've gotten this account of like sympathy and the formal and narrative unity of the world, um, like, and uh, Iamblichus says that can explain some of the effects of ritual. So, like, it makes sense, like, that you're trying to overcome your, your greed, and you sacrifice, a very expensive ox, and that, helps you overcome your greed in some sense, and that, so that narrative function that does explain something of what's going on in sacrifice, but it's not enough. Why? Well, because the gods, they transcend nature. And nature here is not just one thing pushing another. It is, the narratively coherent universe. The gods, qua gods, are beyond narrative, right? In part because they're going to be the grounds of narrative. They are what, they are the storytellers. They are the ones that, and there are some which are even prior to stories, and so it's, you cannot explain something that's supposed to elicit a response from the storytellers by doing something that affects the story, right? Of course, what you do, since whatever you do is in the story, will have story effects, but that's not all that's going on in sacrifice, right? and and this is and so what will let me see. um right, and then just to give one more argument that he provides, so is that one way that we can see that sacrifice isn't just about pure things, is that about material things and their connections, is that you burn sacrifices, and fire, you know, transforms things and takes them away from matter. So he writes, the present line of inquiry seems to me to exhibit also another error, for it ignores the fact that the offering of sacrifices by means of fire is actually such as to consume and annihilate matter, assimilating it to itself rather than assimilating itself to matter, and elevating it toward the divine, heavenly, and immaterial fire, instead of being weighed downwards towards matter in the realm of regeneration. For if in fact the enjoyment ensnaring demons by means of exhalation from matter were based on a sort of natural attractiveness of matter, so this is the idea that, these daimons, these uh, spirits are drawn to matter, and we're feeding them with sacrifices, then the matter should have remained intact. If they're material demons that want matter, we should preserve the matter. For in this way, the emanation from it would become greater to those that participate in it. But as it is, the matter is all burned up and consumed and transformed into the purity and subtlety of fire. And this is a clear indication of the opposite of what you are maintaining. In fact, the superior class of being are impassive, and it is pleasing to them that the matter is eliminated by the fire, and they render us also impassive. They assimilate what is in us to the gods, even as the fire assimilates all that is solid and resistant to luminous subtle bodies, and leads us up by means of sacrifice and sacrificial fire towards the fire of the gods, in the same way that the fire ascends towards the fire which attracts it, and draws up downward tending and resistant entities, the divine and heavenly ones. So there's a lot here, but he's also pointed, but one of the things that goes together with what we just saw here is that, of course, you destroy things in sacrifice. And that is, death and destruction are typically seen as, narrative problems for the narrativity of the world. This is, as it were, this is a form of the problem of evil. Oh, you're saying the world's all harmonious, but and like everything follows to its natural end. But no, things are constantly ending before their natural end. And totally destroying something on an altar is a destructive thing. There's something anti-natural here that's going on. There's more that's going on here because there's this similarity between fire and light that he's playing on, and so on. So there's more here besides that. This is like uh, one thing. So you're removing something from the natural harmony of the universe. You're destroying this part of the universe. And so he's saying, so that shows that, an account just based on sympathy or on matter doesn't can't explain everything that's going on here. Um, we'll pick up from here next time.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah,
Next week is okay for you?
I hope so. That's
Okay.
next week. Just gonna check.
That'll be
Hmm.
the 29th.
Yeah. Yeah, should be fine. So
Okay.
we're not okay.
And yeah, have a good week.
Okay, thank you. It was a good fun. Okay. Bye bye.